I hope everyone can see my screen, and it's great to see so many folks joining us today for the webinar. I'll just quickly introduce what we're doing at JPAL with the Cash Transfers for Child Health initiative. So broadly, this initiative is a pool of funding that was launched in 2016 to fund research on child health and how cash transfers and pay for performance schemes in particular can improve child health outcomes. And over the years, we're wrapping up this year, and over the years, we've funded about 26 different studies of covering different topics, different types of studies, and covering different geographies in India. So it's been really great to kind of work on this, but as we wrap up, we want to kind of synthesize what we've learned, and that's why we're doing this event today, and it's part of a larger event series that we're doing, so do keep an eye out for future events that are coming up. We're sort of summarizing and disseminating whatever we've learned in 6 years of this health-focused research. And today's event, which features Kartik Muralidharan, Seema Jayachandran, and Ami Mishra, is on when evidence meets policy, helping India's state governments respond to public health challenges. And Seema and Kartik will speak about their studies on air pollution and on nutrition / early childhood education, respectively. And as you can see, another sort of upcoming event, which will be a really interesting one, is going to be on deliberating on the policy relevance of catch research on nutrition. So do keep an eye out. I'll just quickly introduce all the speakers and then hand it over to Ami, who has generously agreed to moderate today's event. So Seema, who is a professor of economics at Northwestern University and also is a co-chair of the Cash Transfers for Child Health initiative, works on environmental conservation, gender equality, health, and other microeconomic topics in developing countries. Today, she'll be speaking about her study on air pollution. Seema is on the board of directors of JPAL and also leads JPAL's gender sector. She is also co-director of NBER's program in development economics and co-editor of the American Economic Journal, Applied Economics. In addition, she serves on CARE's board of directors. Kartik Muralidharan, who is our other speaker today, is the education sector lead at JPAL, and he's also the Tata Chancellor's Professor of Economics at the University of California, San Diego. Born and raised in India, he earned his undergraduate degree in economics from Harvard, an MPhil in economics from Cambridge, and a PhD in economics from Harvard. He is a research associate of the NBER, a fellow and board member of the Bureau for Research and Economic Analysis of Development, a board member and co-chair of the education program at JPAL, and an affiliate at the Center for Effective Global Action and a research affiliate with IPA. His primary research interests include development, public, and labor economics. And today he'll be speaking about his study on nutrition. And finally, Ami, who is our moderator for the discussion today, is the senior economist and head of policy at UNDP India. She's a development practitioner with experience across trade and investment, public finance, education, climate change, development finance, and gender. Ami has worked with governments, think tanks, and bilateral and multilateral development agencies across India and Africa. Before joining the UN, she worked as the economic advisor of the FCDO at the British High Commission in New Delhi, where she provided evidence-based advice to the UK government on development policy and managed large global and bilateral aid programs. So just a quick set of housekeeping rules. Please do keep dropping all your questions in the chat box as and when they occur to you. We'll be collating them, and Ami will be sort of leading an ongoing discussion informed by your questions. And if you have any sort of logistical concerns, feel free to DM me or my colleagues Bhakti or Shantana on the chat. Thanks so much. And please just put your questions on the Q&A and you can please do not use the raise hand feature. Thanks so much. Over to you, Ami, to set the context.
Thank you, Molshri. To begin with, I just want to point out that even as COVID-19 continues its hold over any conversations that any of us are having on public health or indeed public policy over the last 2 years, there remain other very important public health and development challenges that India has been persistently grappling with. Today, we'll be discussing two of these here: early childhood health / nutrition and air pollution. Now, if you look at nutrition, the most recent data from the 5th NFHS, the National Family Health Survey, shows progress on some key indicators, including the share of institutional births, improvements in infant and under 5 mortality, and other child nutrition indicators such as stunting, wasting, and being underweight. At the same time, however, there are some alarming deteriorations, including the rise of anemia in children and severe wasting, which is low weight for height, in children below 5. Both health in India, more generally, and nutrition continue to be underfunded. COVID, of course, has not made things easier. It has lowered access, and it has worsened existing inequalities. Pollution, on the other hand, has had a bit of an unexpected impact from COVID, and lockdowns provided sort of a temporary respite from air pollution in India's cities. But if you live anywhere in or around Delhi, you're probably already bracing yourselves for what's coming up. In 2021, India was home to 11 of the 15 most polluted cities in Central and South Asia. In fact, there's no city in India that meets the WHO air quality guidelines. The 10 most polluted cities in the world are all in Northern India. I don't need to tell you that this has severe health impacts, including chronic illnesses and even premature deaths. Both of these severe challenges require an urgent response from governments, particularly those in the states. And now, given that most policymakers that you meet across the board routinely grapple with the twin challenges of sort of limited resources on one hand and competing priorities, the importance of quality, reliable evidence that they can use and that can point them to scalable solutions that work in a cost-effective manner is not something that can be overstated. So in this context, I'm very happy that we have with us today Dr. Karthik Muralidharan and Dr. Seema Jayachandran to talk about their recent work. Thank you both very much for being here. I'm very, very happy to welcome you. As Molshri has said, Dr. Muralidharan is a professor of economics at the University of California, San Diego, and Dr. Jayachandran is a professor of economics at Northwestern University. I will tell you that she's also the writer of my favorite popular economics column in the New York Times. Thank you both again. Let me first invite Dr. Muralidharan to tell us about his recent work, where he has very closely examined the Integrated Child Development Scheme, or what is popularly known as ICDS, and identified cost-effective ways to make it deliver better. Even though the government announced Poshan 2 in 2021, it's yet to be rolled out, and ICDS remains the primary vehicle through which the government is currently delivering early childhood education and nutrition in India. Over to you, Dr. Muralidharan.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, perfect. Let me share the screen and let's get started here. Since I believe I have exactly 12 minutes. Okay, so so thanks to JPAL for organizing this. Thanks to Ami for moderating and that excellent introduction. I think that sets up the scene really nicely, right? I think we know these. So let's get started. This is joint work with Ale, who's a professor at the NYU School of Education, and Chris Walters at UC Berkeley. So the motivation is, there is clearly increasing policy interest in India around the world in providing high quality early childhood education and corresponding increase in nutrition. We all know and accept that these early childhood interventions matter a lot. I think in India, there has not actually been a lack of policy commitment. So if you look at our policy documents, there's an entire 86th Amendment to the Constitution that talked about the importance of early childhood education. This is there in the Right to Education Act. We have a national ECCE policy framework. It's kind of gets pride of place in the national education policy. So at some level, it's not like we need to convince policymakers that this is important, right? The problem in India, as with everything else, is that the issue is not of intention. The issue is of state capacity to actually implement and translate these intentions into outcomes. Because what ends up happening is we know all of these things are important, but as I will kind of expand in this book of mine, which I've been working on for the last 3 years and should be out later this year, is that one of our core challenges in India is that, we're trying to build a modern welfare state at a tax to GDP ratio that's half of what you have in the OECD, which just means that there's fundamentally not enough money for everything you want to do. And so you end up having a lot of lip service and notional kind of agreements and policy to do a bunch of things without always having the resources to back that. Okay, so the problem, of course, is that money is tight and we need evidence about how do you improve ECD outcomes at scale. And that's basically what, motivated this research program of ours over the last 5 years in the state of Tamil Nadu. But the fundamental question really is, as Ami said, ICDS is the world's largest early childhood scheme. It is the government of India's primary vehicle for delivering early childhood development goals. And so how should we strengthen this in the most effective and cost-effective ways? So the project was conducted as part of an institutional partnership between JPAL and the government of Tamil Nadu. So this itself is a signature agreement whereby you have this agreement with the government where different departments propose ideas that they would like evaluated, and the planning department put aside an innovation fund from where the interventions were funded, and initiatives like Catch then supported in terms of the evaluation of those projects. So what we did was we worked with the Department of Social Welfare to test and evaluate 4 different ways of strengthening the ICDS. The first was hiring an extra early childhood care and education facilitator with a focus on preschool education, but kind of with the understanding that this could have spillover effects to nutrition by freeing up the time of the existing worker. There was an unconditional 20% pay increase for existing Anganwadi workers. There was a performance-linked bonus that paid an equivalent 20% based on improvements in nutrition outcomes. And there was a supplemental nutrition program of providing an extra glass of milk in the morning to children in treated Anganwadis. So these were done in distinct Anganwadis, large-scale randomized evaluation. And the choice of these interventions kind of reflects a field scoping study we did before we started this work, inputs from the government of Tamil Nadu, prior research and literature, and frankly, the most important thing is the share of the budget. Okay, so if you look at where does the money go, the money fundamentally goes for staffing and kind of feeding programs and food delivery broadly. And so we were like, let's kind of look at where the budget is going and kind of evaluate interventions that roughly reflect those budgetary priorities. So this was done across 4 randomly chosen districts in Tamil Nadu. Again, if I had more time, I would show you maps and a lot more details and sampling, but we think it may be the largest RCT to date on early childhood education in the ICDS. And again, given my background has been more in education than nutrition, I came into this project primarily interested in early childhood education. And we, over time, added the nutrition interventions because that's kind of what the ICDS was spending most of its time on. And so today we're going to focus mainly on the first intervention, which is the extra facilitator, but I'll discuss these other results along with cost effectiveness. Okay. So the facilitated intervention is remarkably simple. Okay, it's just we had done a scoping study that showed that even though you have 2 hours a day scheduled for early childhood education from 10 to 12 in the morning, in practice you were getting only about 38 minutes a day of preschool instruction. And so we just said, it's clear, and Rukmini Banerjee of Pratham, once famously described the Anganwadi worker as the Ma Durga of the system, that she's one woman is handling everything from preschool education to home visitation to nutrition counseling to feeding to running the center and maintaining registers of about 14 different registers of paperwork. And so essentially, they just clearly, short-staffed on the field. And people have been asking, and ICDS advocates for over 2 decades have been talking about the importance of an extra worker, but the typical response has been that there's not been enough money. And the other reason why Tamil Nadu is a good place to do this is Tamil Nadu, in fact, had institutional memory in the 80s and early 90s of kind of doing, I think it's just 80s actually, a 2-worker model under what was called the Tamil Nadu Integrated Nutrition Project. That was a World Bank funded project. But as with a lot of these things, once the donor funding dried up, the program also stopped, right? So this was then something that the government of Tamil Nadu Finance Department themselves were really interested in seeing, is this something that makes sense for them to do of their own budget? And so that's what kind of motivated this intervention and study. So the facilitators were hired in 2-year contracts. They're very similar to the Anganwadi worker criteria. They had to be female, at least 18, reside in the local community, and have passed 10 standard exams. So the government already had an ECE curriculum with UNICEF. So there's a lot of other very interesting work on ECE that looks at changing the curriculum, looks at different delivery. And like I said, the way to think about what we're doing here is an out and out a state capacity intervention, right? Because the curriculum is there, the program is there. It's just that there weren't staff available to transact that curriculum. Okay, so the facilitators were provided a week of training, and that's basically it. They were paid a very modest stipend of 4,000 rupees a month compared to an Anganwadi worker salary of 8,000 because they were supposed to work for half a day and conduct preschool activities in that 10 to 12 window. So normally, like, the structure of these centers, you open about 9 to 10 kids are drifting in, 10 to 12 is scheduled time for preschool instruction, 12 to 1 is the midday meal, and then kids take a nap, and then there's supposed to be some work afterwards. So the worker has a full day's work, but the preschool education window is 10 to 12, and this worker was, meant to focus in that window. So we'll talk about external validity at the end to other states, but Tamil Nadu, as we know, is a reasonably high capacity state when it comes to kind of social service delivery. And so they really implemented the intervention well. Staff were hired within a month. And that's, I think, important for the scalability, that the supply elasticity is not a constraint, because you have a supply of educated, high school educated young women in the villages who are easily available, and kind of filling the positions was not a problem at all. The 6-day training was provided to nearly all facilitators, and the payments were timely. Okay, so overall, unlike many other RCTs in developing countries where things don't work, at least here the intervention implementation was done remarkably well by the government. Okay, so let's get straight to results. There's an RCT, so things are balanced. I'm only showing you this to see some of the summary stats, right? So the gender balance is about 50-50. So the children about 3.5 years old, you got malnutrition rates of being underweight and stunting of about 35%. Okay, so that was my time check. Okay, so let's just get to the straight results. Okay, so we collected independent data on learning outcomes. So this is highly non-trivial, measuring learning outcomes for young children. These are individually administered oral tests. We can talk more about that. And then one important kind of interpretation issue is that children from these centers, because the age is 3 to 5, even in the 18 months of the study, a lot of them age out of the study, a lot of them move to private schools, a lot of them migrate. So if you look at the follow-up rates in the centers, it's only about 33%. Okay, there's no differential attrition. So this is still completely experimentally valid, but there's only about 1/3. Okay, so we also augment this with a complete household sample, where we do a representative sample of the baseline and have a follow-up rate of 90%. So, but the way you should think about this is that the effects at the center represent the effects on children who actually actively attend the center for 18 months during the program. And the household is going to be a weaker ITT effect that includes children who graduated out and moved on and dropped out and stuff like that. Okay. So for policy, we'll do the cost effectiveness. I'll do the more conservative estimates. We got heightened weight on the nutrition and anthropometrics. We've got surveys of implementation fidelity. And then we also have these unannounced visits where we make random visits and sit down in the centers from 10 to 12 and just code up all the activities that happen. Okay. So let me get straight to results. And one of the things that we spent a lot of time on is measuring time used within the centers so that we could get into the black box of how exactly this extra worker affected the life in the ICDS. Okay. So if you look at column 2, Column 2 tells you what's going on in a typical control center. How does the Anganwadi worker allocate her time in that 2-hour observation window? So, amazingly, we got 38 minutes even in our much larger sample, which is what we got in our 24-center scoping study. So you get about 38 minutes a day spent on preschool education. About 20% of the time goes to administrative tasks. The denominator here is 120, right? That's 120 minutes. And there's a modest, there's about 5 or 6 minutes in health and nutrition. This is typically kind of the transition to the feeding time. So we code things like washing your hands and using the toilet and stuff like that as health and nutrition related tasks. But then about 30 minutes is just spent off duty. Okay, so that includes just maybe not being in the center. Well, it's not even absent. Absent is another 24 minutes. Off duty is you're there, but probably just, doing something else, not teaching, not engaged in any activity. Okay. Now, when this extra worker, the extra facilitator, she spends close to an hour on preschool education. Okay. And now what column 3 is telling you is how does the behavior and the time use of the worker in the treatment center change in response to the presence of this extra facilitator? And unsurprisingly, the time spent on preschool education goes down. the time spent on administrative tasks goes up. Okay, so the modal response was that the regular worker would sit and supervise the work of the preschool of the facilitator while she would be doing a lot of her paperwork, and they have a ton of paperwork to complete. Now, it's not like they didn't do any preschool education, right? But that was typically what was happening. Okay, and but there is also an increase in time spent on health and nutrition, right, which is not that much, but of a low base, it's going to end up being quite important. So what we care about overall for the children is, if you look at column 5, that's telling you the total staff time spent on these tasks in the treatment centers added across the worker and the facilitator. And the column 6 is then the treatment effect on time use, which is, let's look at the total time used in the treatment centers minus the total time used in the control centers. And that's how you see that there's a doubling in time on preschool instruction that goes from about 38 minutes to about 76 minutes. Okay. So that's a substantial impact in terms of the first stage. And then the nutrition time goes from about 6 minutes to 16 minutes. And I think this is almost certainly an understatement, because remember, we are observing in the 2 hours, which is the preschool education window. Okay. So it's quite likely that when you have 2 workers, then during the school feeding time, for example, that you may be able to better cater to the malnourished children. After the baseline, we do give the center's data on the nutrition status of each child. So, we can come back and talk a little bit more about mechanisms then. Okay, but bottom line is time goes up substantially on the tasks that we care about. And unsurprisingly, you get these large significant impacts on learning outcomes. Okay, so in the center level assessments, you get, 0.29 standard deviations in maths, 0.46 in language. These are huge effects. Okay. Then you get a composite treatment effect across these 3 domains of about 0.29 standard deviations. In the household assessments, the effects are roughly about 1/3. Okay. And that's mainly because the sample of exposure is 1/3. So you can do an ITT-TOT kind of adjustment, and it basically ends up being very similar, right? That you can think about the center level assessment treatment effects is about 3 times larger and 1/3 as many children, and the household effects are diluted because of lower exposure. Okay, so what we're going to do is, you should think about the center as what's happening to the child who's actively attending, and the household estimates are what we'll use for cost effectiveness, so that we can be very conservative. Okay, this is then just showing you the distributions, and you can see that the treatment effects, the treatment distribution first order stochastically dominates, which just basically means that for every child at every part of the distribution, the treatment kids are better off in terms of the learning outcomes, whether you do this by end-line quantile treatment effects or by the baseline score. So, and then I think since the motivation here is health, right? In fact, this ended up being the surprise result. So frankly, we thought there might be some positive effects, but we didn't expect to find these significant effects on child malnutrition. Now, again, this only shows up in the center-based measurement, which is not surprising, again, given that that's where the kids are actually attending. Okay, but what you see is this kind of significant increase in both weight for age z-scores and height for age z-scores of roughly 0.1 standard deviations, and a significant reduction and the fraction of severely underweight as well as severely stunted. Okay, so this is a substantial reduction. On a base of severe stunting of about 5.7%, you're getting a 2.3 percentage point reduction. That's almost a 40% reduction. Okay, so and these are non-trivial gains, and it's happening in the center sample. So finally, turning to cost effectiveness, right? There's 2 approaches to do this. One, which is kind of from a public finance perspective, what matters is what is the long-term benefit cost ratio, okay? The problem is that this requires stronger assumptions of the long-term returns, okay? And we don't have such estimates in India. So let me go look at my time check. Oh, time is up. Okay, I'm told. All right, I will wrap up on this slide. We have to use global estimates, and based on these global estimates, we estimate that this benefit cost ratio is about 13x. And that's not including the nutrition gains. Okay, so basically, we're talking about a 1200% ROI on doing this. And the gains in future tax revenues we estimate will likely exceed the benefits. And so the cost is actually negative, with a return on investment of doing this of about infinite. Okay. Now, the problem is that relies on strong long-term assumptions that may not apply. So the other way you can do this is compare policy options within the ICDS, especially across the board increase in pay. And this is really important because the political economy of spending is that the incumbents always have a stronger lobbying voice than the outsiders who have not yet been hired. So in practice, if you look at where the budget goes, the bulk of the budget goes to across the board increases in pay. And what we find is that had no effect on education and small and inconsistent effects on nutrition. And we also found, surprisingly, no effects of performance pay or the supplemental nutrition. Okay, so I can talk a bit more about that in the Q&A, but the bottom line is it suggests that the key binding constraint here to ICDS performance is not actually the pay of existing workers, but augmenting staff strength, that the single worker simply has too many ECD responsibilities, even with the helper for cooking and cleaning. Okay, so I'm at time, okay, so I'm not going to repeat this. Let me just say this at the end. So obviously, there's one concern here that about external validity beyond Tamil Nadu, right? Tamil Nadu is a better administered state, so I don't think this is a study on the basis of which we should say let's go scale this up across the country. But I really do think that we have enough evidence here of how promising this is, that we should consider kind of staggered, phased multi-state rollouts, and these are things that we can continue evaluating in other settings so that we can see if these benefits translate. And given that we typically expand programs nationwide with no evidence whatsoever, I think this is probably more evidence in something that has strong effects and positive effects and highly cost effective than we've had. So I feel very confident recommending to states that this is something that they should consider for serious pilots and evaluations going forward. So let me stop there.
Great. Thank you, Karthik, for that presentation. You really raced through that one. Thank you very much. I think, there are some questions coming in from the audience. There's a question, if you look at the monitoring both student outcomes, facilitator participation, paying their salaries, training them, etc. These are fairly resource intensive processes, especially in the context of the ICDS, where getting additional funding has always been a bit of an uphill battle. And if you look at the cost benefit analysis that you present, the gains are effectively fairly long term. Come much later. So do you see any challenges in convincing governments to invest in this treatment today, given the upfront costs and the gains that are going to come much later?
No, and I think, I think this is where sometimes I think advocates for different social development programs tend to get a little skeptical of the economists and think of the economists as bean counters. The people in finance say there's no money, but I think this is a case where everybody really is, on the same side, right? We're trying to find the most cost effective things to do. And, my sense, I presented this in a workshop at Niti Aayog with kind of the Secretary Education, Secretary WCD. And I think the reaction was actually quite positive. Of course, there's a reasonable concern that somebody asked in the chat as well, is would this work in UP? Would this work in Bihar? Would this work in places with lower capacity? And my honest answer is I don't know. Okay. So, but that being said, I feel cautiously optimistic based on the results we have to say that would I very, very strongly go and recommend a next stage pilot that covers, say, 500 centers, okay, or 1,000 centers in a few states? I would say absolutely, because this is relatively inexpensive compared to other things we do. And I think this is where we need to be really hard-headed about where we're spending our money, right? So right to education reduces class size in schools from 40 to 1 to 30 to 1. And that, the regular government civil service teacher is incredibly expensive. And you have problems of absence and stuff because they're often not connected to the community living far away. So I think the larger message I have in terms of state capacity is the core problem for state capacity in India is that we pay regular workers, not the Anganwadis, regular government workers. We pay too much, but we hire too few. Okay. So if you look at the salary distributions of regular government workers are 4 or 5 times what you get in the market wage, but you just don't have enough money to hire enough of them. Okay. So Econ 101 would tell you that if you're able to kind of more cost effectively augment staffing, that you're going to do much better. And I see this really as a study in that vein, right? Meaning that saying that you can take local staff, even with kind of 10th pass or 12th pass with 1 week of training and get remarkably large effects, right? Whereas sometimes I think what we tend to do is we make perfect the enemy of the good by saying that if you want to do ECE, we must have highly qualified, well-paid, and yes, if you had a higher GDP per capita and a tax to GDP ratio of 35%, those are things that you can get to. But right now where you are, remember that these jobs are not, people often say workers are underpaid, but the jobs are actually quite aspirational. You get multiple applicants for the job and it's remarkably effective at female empowerment as well. We've got very good work talking about how educated young women face barriers to working outside the village, right? So if you were to augment something like this, I think you get a triple whammy because you get the benefit for the children, you get the benefit for the workers, right? In terms of young women who are getting the jobs and getting the empowerment. And then we've also got additional research about the role model effects of seeing young women working. And I think that'll also cascade down. And then, the third benefit, which obviously we are not quantifying here, is benefits to female labor supply from kind of making the Anganwadis more reliable as a source of daycare, right? So it's also going to have spillover effects on the mothers. So I think there's an enormous set of benefits that would come from scaling something like this. So my goal for the next 3 to 5 years is to actually architect a 2-worker intervention-based ICDS system strengthening program that we're able to test with large-scale RCTs in 3 to 5 years, in 3 to 5 states. Okay, so Let me give you another example. So JPAL affiliates Orazio, Atanasio, and Costas Megir have this very nice study done with Pratham in Odisha, where they're looking at a maternal counseling program of sending these volunteers home to teach mothers on how to interact with kind of preschool-age children. And the problem is when they want to scale it up, the government says intervention is good, but I don't have the staff to do it. Okay, so you could imagine taking this study to justify the second worker, taking a bunch of other studies to then optimize the time use of the two workers. Okay, saying now if I have two workers based on everything I know on evidence-based interventions, how would you optimize the time of the two workers across health and nutrition, across home visitation, across the center? And how would you then design a study that both implements this and tests outcomes on a range of measures, including impacts on the workers, impacts on the mothers? And those are things that we hope to do in the years going forward.
Thank you. Thanks, Karthik, for that. I've been reminded that we need to be mindful of time. So I'm going to now straight away invite Dr. Jayachandran, Seema.
And sorry, and I will try to answer a bunch of questions in chat. So
okay,
yeah,
fantastic. Thank you.
Great. Karthik, if you can unshare your screen, then I'll
sorry.
Go ahead.
Good.
Over to you.
Perfect.
Okay, great. As I'm getting my slides up, let me say, in wearing my hat as a Catch co-chair, I want to thank Karthik for that amazing work he's doing, and thank Ami for participating in this with us. Okay, but now I'm going to switch and have my researcher hat on, and I'm going to talk about work with Kelsey Jack, Namrata Kala, and Rohini Pandey that's trying to reduce crop burning to improve air pollution. Okay, so as many of you who are in North India right now have noticed, there's increasing pollution, and one reason for that is the increasing use of crop residue burning or stubble burning in North India. And so what is that stubble? It's the stalk, 8 to 12 inches of stalk or residue that's left with mechanical harvesting of rice or paddy. And so that's the one big reason why you see this increasing trend in crop burning, which on this figure is the red line. It's because of the increased use of mechanical harvesting. There are a bunch of other factors, but another one is the very short window between when people are harvesting their paddy and planting their winter crop, which is usually wheat, and that's partly related to restrictions on groundwater use. So there are a confluence of reasons why this problem is rising, and the implications of it are far-reaching. So the burning in Punjab or North Indian states in general is not only creating local pollution, it's a big contributor to the pollution in New Delhi. So at the peak days, it's attributed that 30 to 40% comes from crop burning. Overall over the winter, it's something like 25%. Okay, so why is that burning still happening? This is a classic environmental externality where, from the farmer's perspective, burning is the cheapest option. The other option is to rent crop residue management equipment, which, depending on the type, is going to cost him 1,000 to 3,000 rupees per acre. And that's even with some government subsidy programs in place. So just to kind of motivate why this is a really important problem, and I'm going to talk about one solution of cash transfers, but I think my big takeaway from this project is there should be more time and money and attention to this problem, because the costs of solving it are going to be much lower than the benefits of solving it. So that's just one back of the envelope calculation. The mortality costs of burning are something like 200 to 500 times the farmer's benefits from burning and the cost savings. And so I'm not going to go through the calculations in the interest of time, but that's taking estimates of there being about 66,000 deaths per year from burning of crops in North India. How much is burned? What is that per acre? And so those damages from mortality are on the order of $7,600 US or over 500,000 rupees per acre. That's just mortality. It's also causing sickness. It's reducing labor productivity, so hurting the economy. And it also contributes to climate change. Okay, so what are the alternatives farmers could use? There's two types of crop residue management: the in situ, where it's mulched into the soil, or the ex situ, where the residue is removed from the field, usually with and put into bales. Sometimes that can be used in biogas or for building materials or something. You can also use labor to remove it, but that's not a popular option, partly because labor costs have been rising. Okay, so the policy context in which we did this project. It's a part of a JPAL, South Asia Government of Punjab partnership. It's a context where residue burning is illegal. It's been illegal since 2015. There are fines. There's limited enforcement, or certainly not enough enforcement to solve this problem. That's partly because of enforcement capacity, but it's also, a challenging demand on a local government, to fine its constituents for something that's mostly benefiting people beyond its borders. And I think with that in mind, the government of India has been allocating money to Punjab and Haryana mostly to subsidize the in situ equipment. So either large farmers as individuals, or most farmers would get it through a rental company or an agricultural co-op that was able to buy that equipment at a subsidized price. However, that still leaves many farmers choosing to burn, as we're observing, and that's partly because of rental companies are often the monopoly in their village, so they have market power and are still charging high prices. But it's not just that. When we think about this problem from the farmer's perspective, the price needs to be very low for this to be a better option than burning, and a partial subsidy is not getting close enough to that. And a smaller issue is that many farmers prefer the ex situ management for various reasons, and so most of the subsidies have been on the in situ. Okay, so what did our study do? We evaluated an alternative approach of payments for ecosystem services, which is fancy jargon for a cash transfer, a financial reward for doing something good. In this case, it's not burning your field. And the idea is to compensate people for the costs that they bear when they're not generating that environmental externality. So compared to a penalty, a fine, it's basically a carrot rather than a stick. Compared to the equipment subsidies, it's directly paying the farmer and just rewarding the outcome rather than a specific input like in situ equipment. So we conducted an RCT across 171 villages in Bathinda and Faridkot, two districts in Punjab. And in addition to just seeing whether PES in general works, one thing we tried to do is think about how can we design PES, and this is applicable to other conditional cash transfers, how can we design them in light of two challenges that are true in our context and often true in low-income countries, which is trust barriers and cash or liquidity constraints. What do I mean by that? We're asking people to pay some money to rent equipment with the promise that if they don't burn, we'll pay them later as a reward. And they have to trust that we're going to pay them, or that the government is going to pay them. And similarly, if they don't have cash on hand to rent that equipment, they might think, that yes, that money makes this reward is enticing, but I don't have the money right now to rent it. So we varied with our treatments whether some of the money was actually paid upfront before you engaged in the activity, and we actually made that upfront part unconditional. So we weren't going to take it back if you burned. And so the idea is that, the upfront should build trust. It should give farmers liquidity. But first of all, we kept the total amount fixed. So when we give more upfront unconditionally, we're actually giving a smaller reward for not burning. And second, we're giving some money to people who went ahead and burned. And so for both of those reasons, it could be less effective or less cost effective to do that tweak to the design. Okay, so the RCT had 4 treatment arms. So we had the control villages, and then we had 2 standard PES where we varied the amount. And let me make a point about this amount. I think if we as the researchers had chosen an amount, we would have chosen a higher amount just because the costs to the farmers are more than 800 acres for many of them. But we also wanted to pick an amount that the government, we thought might be feasible to scale up. So I would still say these payments are too low, but we still are able to see some interesting results. So we have 800 acres, and then we had a 1600 just to test this idea that paying more has a bigger effect. And then we have 2 with the upfront payment, where we either gave 25% of the amount upfront and then the other 600 rupees conditional, or half upfront and half conditional ex post. So here's our data. We did a listing survey by phone using the agricultural co-op data in 300 villages. We zeroed in on farmers who were growing farming 2 to 12 acres of paddy. And we zeroed in on ones who are likely to burn based on some questions that gave us an indication of that from the previous year. Then we did a baseline survey in person. Then in the treatment group, we offered them the contract. I didn't say this is in 2019. So this is in the last winter before the pandemic. And then we did monitoring of compliance. So the way we monitored the compliance was in person. We went and checked for signatures of burning. And, important to say here is like that in this case, it's a partnership with the government, but the intervention in this case was done by JPAL South Asia. And then we did an end-line survey to understand self-reported crop yield. So that's the on-the-ground field work. Our main measure of whether you burned, or the one where we can actually see it in the control group too, uses satellite imagery. So we combine Planet and Sentinel-2 data and a remote sensing machine learning algorithm to detect burning. Okay, so now let me present the results. So first of all, there's kind of a first step, which is when we went back to villages and after the baseline survey to offer the contract, we didn't find everyone. So we found about 88 to 89% of people. And with all of these results, this is how we pre-specified our main analysis. We're going to pool the 2 standard PES, where everything is conditional after the fact, and then the upfront payment arms. So anyway, this 90%, you should think of it as like a scale factor because those are the only people we actually offer the contract to. And so of those, 73% of the overall sample, 73% took up the contract. There's something a little surprising here. We might have expected that more people would take the upfront arm because there was some free money, even if they were going to burn. I think even our contract, there was probably some trust issues of taking it up. Okay, so here is the data where for the control group, these are just by definition 0. But for the treatment groups, we can see how many people called us to say, we want you, we've now cleared our stubble, come check and verify that we haven't burned. So we sort of asked them to call us for logistical reasons. And focusing on the right-hand side, we have how many people we went and verified that they hadn't burned their fields. And we see that's 9 percentage points for the treatment group and 18 percentage points for the upfront arms. So you could say, this isn't 100%. We didn't get everyone to switch. And I think that's related to the payments still left people having to pay more, some out of pocket, or at least some people. But we made it statistically significant and kind of an important dent in this problem. And you start to see that the upfront had a bigger effect. So now this is using the remote sensing measure of burning. And so here in our control group, 7% didn't burn. So most 93% of people burned in our control group. And so now you could see what was the additional gain in not burning from the treatments. So it's 5 percentage points and not statistically significant for standard PES. So some of those people who complied and we paid, they weren't going to burn anyway. But you see that there was this big increase or tripling of the rate of not burning when we had the upfront component to the PES. Okay, so here I combine the arms, but here you could see it arm by arm where we see you get a 4 percentage increase in clearing without burning with the lowest paying PES, a 7 percentage point. So we can't reject that these are the same, but the point estimates are suggesting paying more gets more people to comply. But you could see that, these 800 arms, even though they were paying less than the 1,600, they have a bigger effect on getting people to clear without burning. Okay, some other findings. We don't find strong evidence on which mechanism explains whether it's trust or liquidity. We see that balers ex situ is what most people switch to. We don't see any effect on self-reported yield. And in the spirit of catch, we don't have a lot of statistical power to see effects on child health, but we don't detect any. So let me just wrap up with cost effectiveness and how to think about scaling. So, the upfront had a bigger effect. It might not be more cost effective because we paid out more, which is partly due to higher compliance, but partly because some people got upfront money and then went ahead and burned. And so we could kind of combine our different estimates to think about how much did it cost to avert an acre from being burned. And we see that the upfront payments are not only more effective, they're more cost effective. Yes, you pay out more per acre, but you have a much bigger effect on reducing burning. So counterintuitively to me, they turn out to be the most cost-effective approach. And coming back to kind of the problem is so big that these solutions are very cost-effective. Our most cost-effective treatment costs 2,000 rupees per averted acre of burning. And recall that just the mortality costs are 500,000 rupees per acre. So, there are other costs or administrative costs. You might have some challenges scaling up, but there's just so much room between when you have this factor of 250 that this seems worth investing more in trying at a higher scale and tweaking. So could it be scaled up? Our monitoring was in person and logistically challenging. You could do that with remote sensing. You need plot boundaries. There's some challenges there. I think there's a version of this where you try it at the panchayat level as the government rewards the panchayat, and the panchayat in turn tries to incentivize or give free equipment to farmers. We zeroed in on a group of farmers who were very likely to burn. If you scaled this up, you'd be paying more people who weren't going to burn anyway. So that's going to reduce cost effectiveness. But with this factor of 250, these aren't going to get you in the red in terms of cost effectiveness. And to Karthik's other way of thinking about cost effectiveness, this is also a much more cost effective way than other things that have been evaluated to reduce pollution, like putting scrubbers in power plants. And so I think PES is important. I think there are other policies like more technological innovation, thinking about how to redesign those subsidy schemes, maybe trying to create more competition within villages for rental equipment. I think all of these are important ways forward because the benefits are so much higher than the farmers' costs that there has got to be a feasible, scalable way to solve this problem. So let me stop there.
Thank you, Seema, for your presentation. I'll ask one question and then we can go to the audience question. So the issue of stubble burning is something that has impacted multiple states and has been a point of contention between governments across Delhi, Haryana, and Punjab. So what may be some of the political economy considerations, according to you, that are important for this intervention to succeed? And in fact, how do we get multiple state actors to collaborate? And is that collaboration even necessary?
Yeah, no, I think this is a case where you have to think about borders and cooperation across states, and and this is a role for the government of India. So I think it was quite prescient and advanced thinking for government of India to say, look, this is an externality that's going from Haryana and Punjab to Delhi, and so why should one state hurt its citizens to help another state? Well, that's one role of a federal government, to internalize those cross-border effects, and that's what happened with the equipment subsidy. And I think the equipment subsidy was the right idea in terms of the money. I think that actual form probably didn't turn out to be the best way to reduce it. So I think it'll be interesting to see with op in power in New Delhi and in Punjab. That maybe political parties are another way to have coordination across state boundaries. I think another political economy point that sometimes stands in the way of progress here is that I think in relative terms, people would say, farmers in Punjab are rich, and they're not the poorest of the poor within India, and so that there's very much a kind of a view that people should sacrifice themselves to reduce this pollution. As an economist, that's not how I think about it, or I think that's one where that principle is noble, but if you can't achieve that, you're really throwing a lot of money away, because yes, they might not be people who you would give anti-poverty transfers to, but you're asking them to make a personal sacrifice for others, to be very altruistic. And if instead you said, look, there's so many benefits, let's just pay them enough so that it's in their selfish interest to not burn, you might kind of resent that that they're not sacrificing to do it, but you then solve this massive problem. And so I think that kind of mind shift change about how to think about externalities is really important to solving this problem.
Great. Thank you. Thanks very much. So now we have lots of questions in the audience question box. Seema and Karthik, if I can ask you both to take a look at it. Karthik, if there's a question that you'd like to pick and go first.
I had the advantage of having the time to scroll through that. So, no, I mean, but let me just say, like, Seema, that was fantastic stuff. I've heard about the project, really been waiting to see these results. So look forward to discussing, scaling stuff. But no, anyway, I really, really enjoyed it. Thank you. So let me take three questions and from the bottom. I think there was one question about have there been interventions to reduce the administrative work of the workers, and so the answer is yes and no. So yes, in the sense that there is this digital app that is supposed to reduce this paperwork and make it easier. The bad news is not only there've been hiccups in rolling out the app and the thing and the smartphones, as you might suspect. But what's even worse is that no government that I know of has kind of told the workers to stop doing the paperwork. Now they want the digital records and the paper records, okay? Because the system is still so obsessed with paperwork. So it takes a very long time to get over the inertia that you need these paper records. Okay, so in fact, we were hoping in Tamil Nadu to have another treatment arm that was looking at what we call the MIS intervention, looking exactly at that, but that didn't get rolled out in time. And even if it did, from what we've seen, the paperwork continued. So that's bad news, okay, but that's what it is. There was a question of mechanisms of how much of the education impact is through the nutrition channel, and that's a very good question. So there's obviously the direct effect that comes from the additional instructional time. Now, what we estimate is that the indirect effect through better nutrition is going to explain at most 5% of these effects, because we can estimate the cross-sectional correlation between these nutrition measures and learning outcomes. And that, once you multiply that by the treatment effect, and that's almost certainly an upper bound because the omitted variables kind of, would push that effect up. So we estimate the upper bound of that would be about 5%. Okay, so about 95% of these gains in education outcomes are seeing from that increase in instructional time, but there could be an additional feedback loop through nutrition. I think there are other questions about, Tamil Nadu has historically been interested in these social sectors. How do you get other states to show interest? And I think, that is the hard question. It's the hard question, not just because I think other states care less. The other states just have a lot less money, right? I mean, so the GDP per capita of Bihar is 1/5 of Maharashtra, right? So it's just, and that's why historically the centrally sponsored schemes have played an important role in terms of providing Government of India support. Mainly for equity reasons, right? Now, the problem with centrally sponsored schemes, the way they've been designed historically, is they're also kind of one size fit all and doesn't really accommodate the diversity that you need across states. So one way of kind of encouraging other states to take this up may be kind of, your classic co-financing model where the Government of India puts in a certain amount of money and say, puts in 50% or 1/3, like for states that are willing to kind of match. And then we as JPAL and kind of the other research community can support these through continued evaluations, right? So if you're able to do this in UP and you find similar results, so the results could be bigger because you're starting off a lower base. The results could be weaker because the implementation might be weaker, right? So it could go either way. And so there's a strong case in my mind for replicating the core of this design, the way I talked about, in multiple states. And so that's kind of what I'm really hoping to push in a big way in the coming years. Somebody else had a question about long-term follow-ups. I think this is where COVID really kind of was a problem, because we weren't able to do field work for 2 years. So I think we still have the capacity to potentially go back and find some of the households, but we haven't done that yet. And I worry about attrition in kind of the post-COVID world. There's a final question about why are people not attending as much? And I think, the honest reason is kids get pulled out of preschool for all kinds of reasons, right? Parents often don't even prioritize it. Something, even if one person in the family is sick, you say, oh, there's nobody to take the kid. So it's just almost in many cases an afterthought rather than something that's kind of primarily built into the routines of the kids. So dropouts happen, migration happens, moving to private schools happens, graduating out to government schools happens. So attendance in general tends to be reasonably low in the Anganwadi system. So let me stop there and hand over to Seema.
Great. I'll answer a couple of questions, and I think a couple of them are around this question of how did the government react, and I think it comes back to what Ami was asking about, or my answer to that question about this is one where we should be thinking about where the benefits are and making sure that the beneficiaries are contributing to the cost. So it shouldn't just be the one state or the farmers solving that. In terms of the question of trust, and I think that's our work in progress to see if we can say more on whether it was trust or liquidity. I think with whatever the underlying reason the upfront mattered was, I think you could think about other ways to achieve that. So, for example, if it's trust, it's possible that you only need to do this upfront one time, and then you show through a reputation that you paid. Currently, right now, so many schemes get started and canceled. And in fact, there was a government PES scheme that was announced and then canceled. So people's distrust is legitimate. But I think it's just a reminder, it's worth investing in being trustworthy as a government because it could save you on the bottom line. And so in this case, if you ran the PES program 1 year and showed people that you paid them, maybe the next year you wouldn't need upfront. There might be some ways of setting up some escrow systems or something like that, as well. And in terms of if it's cash constraints, I think speeding up and here the DBT is helping, speeding up when farmers are paid, when they, take their paddy to the Monday, how quickly they're paid, then they might actually have cash on hand at this time when they're needing to rent. Or you could set up a short-term loan program, where you don't have to make it unconditional then. You're just giving people loans, these short-term loans to rent equipment. So I think, we think of this, we did PES with upfront, and I think that's one viable way to scale it up. But I think the broader point is that helps us realize there's some market imperfections that are hurting the effectiveness of PES. You need to think about how to solve those. Could be through upfront payments. It could be through building a reputation. It could be through having lending. It could be through speeding up when payments for minimum support price payments for selling paddy are. So hopefully in the longer run you could have standard PES with better functioning markets, and that would work very well as too.
Great, thanks. Seema, we have a question, I think, from Twitter as well did you observe any difference in behavior between the richer and comparatively poorer farmers? And did you consider controlling for farmers' incomes in your study?
Yeah, so we haven't looked at that heterogeneity between the richer and the poorer. I think it might affect like liquidity, if richer people had more cash on hand, but, ultimately kind of and maybe you think if you have money, you can afford to kind of do something altruistic. But I would say that even for, the relative rich, I think most of them were burning in the control group. And then in terms of controlling for it, because we have the RCT, that shouldn't be a confound. Shouldn't need to control for it. But certainly we could look at the different results in those two different subgroups. And that's a good suggestion.
Karthik, if I could ask you a question about, in fact, following from some of your own work on Best Buys on education. And one of the things that Best Buys showed was that hiring additional resources in a context where other things don't change can actually be a bad buy. How do you think this work and sort of, what we've seen in education, how do you think these two things work together?
Excellent question. In fact, I presented this at Chicago last week and Michael Kramer asked exactly that same question, right? So we're seeing disappointing effects of class size reductions in school education, right? So because fundamentally this is a class size intervention. And so I think there are two things going on. I think the first is that normally with regular teachers, you also have some of the accountability issues, right? So we have evidence that when you hire extra regular teachers, that the absence of the existing teacher goes up, okay? So, but I think and here the workers are local and the absence is low. But I think the bigger issue is not that. The bigger issue is that I think the reason your input-based interventions in education have not been very effective is that they're not addressing the binding constraint, which is that kids have fallen so far behind the curriculum that even if I have an extra teacher and the only thing this teacher is doing is transacting the curriculum, if you see that the kids are 3 grade levels behind, that doesn't really help you that much, correct? But when you have when the kids are so young, they're not behind the curriculum, right? So the mismatch, right, which I think is the biggest reason why the inputs are not translating into outcomes, is less of a concern, when the kids are so young. And I think there's also this very nice Eddie Lazier QJE paper from 2001 that says, the optimal class size in a way is much smaller for younger kids, because the reason class size matters is mainly when children are disruptive and need individual attention, right? So if I'm teaching a college class, the difference between a class of 50 and a class of 100. So yes, the class of 50 might be slightly more personalized, but is it twice as much as effective as a class of 100? No, right? Because that's what it would need to be for the cost effectiveness to hire a second faculty member to teach like 2 classes of 50 as opposed to 1 of 100, correct? But when the kids are really young, that costs are really high. And so the returns to class size tend to be much higher when the kids are younger, more disruptive, than being socialized into the process of education. So I think, and this is consistent, I think, with Heckman and other type of evidence. So from other studies that the returns to these investments in early ages are going to be especially large.
Great, thank you. Thanks. There's a question that is, in fact, to both of you, which is sort of about RCTs in general. Is there a possibility to make all RCTs more politically viable? Because eventually such strong investments in experimentation would depend on whether it was implemented or not and whether it worked. So is there sort of like a general response to RCTs being used as evidence for policy?
Yeah, I'm sure Karthik has his own answer, but I'll give, I think, Karthik's done amazing work of like embedding with government and doing things at scale, and that has a lot of value. I think, I'll make a pitch that there's also value for doing things that are trying to understand, mechanisms. That's has a very policy relevance. Like, so in, Punjab, there's a new party in power since we started this. And so if we sort of just leaned on like some particular government partners, and they're going to scale it up because it's their baby, I think, that wouldn't, that'd be a risky strategy. So I think it's useful I think our evidence is pretty strong on the cost benefit, and that this is one approach. I think we learned some things that apply to other possible solutions, around the need to, build up trust or make sure farmers have liquidity. And so I think you always want things to be thinking about what's politically feasible, but, sometimes our role as researchers can try to push the political debate as well. So I think there's like this tendency to want to have low payments. I'm, hopefully, like part of what we can do with our evidence and in our conversations with policymakers is make them see the value of paying a little bit more, or not worrying that farmers in Punjab are relatively rich. So I take the spirit of the question, but think that some things that seem academic end up being very useful for moving the policy debate as well.
Yeah, and in fact, my answer, I don't even see this as so there's two questions, right? Which is the political support for the experimentation and the evaluations and the research, and then there's the political support for the scaling up, right? What you find. If anything, I consider both of these studies as an exemplar to the increasing political and policy interest in doing the studies, right? So I think let me give a shout out also to JPAL. Just institutionally, right? I don't think these projects would have happened without these institutional JPAL partnerships, right? I think Seema and I have, we've done our RCTs with other partners. It's not like it always has to be with the government, but that institutional partnership, I think, makes this policy relevant from the outset, because the projects and questions are being demanded by the policymakers. Now, then the question is, once you have the evidence, if it's so striking, why is it not being scaled? And I think that's a much more complex political question, right? So, policymaking is a combination of technical inputs, political inputs, administrative inputs, ethical inputs, lobbying inputs. And the best research is, at the end of the day, one set of inputs, right? So I don't think we should abrogate to ourselves kind of having done the study that we should. I always feel nervous kind of, I think there's dissemination, there's recommendation, there is advocacy, right? So I think as academics, 95% of the time we function in the dissemination space, which is here's what we did, here's what we found. I think 5% to 10% in the recommendation space is okay when people say, listen, you're the expert. Can you synthesize for us, what you know, so that you give us your inputs and recommendation? But I get nervous kind of going on to the advocacy stage. And so that's typically, as academics, not something that we would do. But that's why we do these dissemination events for civil society stakeholders. If you think about the ICDS activists and advocates for the past 2 decades, child rights advocates have been talking about the need for a second worker. But usually, it gets limited traction because it's seen as one more demand of activists, right? But, if you take the evidence and bolster that demand, saying that this is how cost effective it is, I think that's how you move the policy needle. The academics, I think, play one, role. And let me say one more thing. Because I think as global policy chair for education in JPAL, we often face this question about how do you estimate the impact of research? And there is kind of a narrow way of thinking about the research impact, which is saying, did this policy get scaled up based on the study? And I think that's a mistake. And I agree 100% with Seema, right? That our job is kind of in generating deeper knowledge. So the better way I think of a metric is if you look at, say, the best buys, right, Amy? And those are policy syntheses that reflect expert discussion, consensus, and about 30, 40, 50% of the inputs of documents like that come from JPAL, studies. So the rigor kind of underlines the broader kind of evidentiary landscape and the building of recommendations. And that is what good science should look like, right? So if you look at sciences, the sciences do a lot more replication, and you'll get these kind of expert committees that synthesize the evidence for policy. You don't have a kind of thing from one study, I'm going to go scale this up, right? So as we become more mature as a discipline, I think we'll start looking a lot more like that.
Great, thank you both. I can see that we are way out of time now. Let me just sort of close with thanking both of you again for this, for joining us, for presenting your wonderful research. Thank you to JPAL for organizing this. I think we can agree that both studies indicate immense potential. There are limitations, but we can all agree to be cautiously optimistic about both these problems. And political economy considerations and implementation on ground is really what's going to tell us that what happens to all of this. So thanks very much, and have a good day, a good evening, a good afternoon, depending on where everybody is. Thank you.
Thank you.